Welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight, and today we have a wonderful guest again, Gary Wayne. He has had a cabin in the woods moment, and he is well rested, and I'm pretty sure his book got boosted as well in the woods. So I'm very happy to have him. We are going to talk a little bit about what is the road to the emerging of the Antichrist and what still is standing in the way. So Gary, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. And yes, I had a very good time at my cottage, and I got a great opportunity to work on my second book. Actually, I have two on the go. I've opted to go forward and continue on a sequel to the Genesis 6 conspiracy. And I think we're going to call it Prehistory and Prophecy. And I wasn't going to do a sequel on it, but so many people said, I want to know more about how it connects to prophecy, prehistory, and I want to know more about what the giants are said in the Bible. I get all the other stuff that you talked about in the other book, and I'm going, well, there is a lot more information. I just thought that might be, a little bit sort of redundant, but so I'm going to try and make it, and I'm making it so that it's not redundant and it just provides more, but now really starts to intersect why it's important to understand that and understand the end time and end time prophecy.
Yeah. So, the Antichrist. I know that was our first interview that we did, and that was about the guardians of the Antichrist. And so first off, we know that the Antichrist will be crowned in Jerusalem. Do you expect that the Middle East in all those events will play a significant role, and maybe that especially Israel will play a significant role in those events?
Well, I think it does. And I'll give a couple of reasons for that. The first thing is if you're coming at it from a Christian or a Judaic perspective, prophecy for the most part, and particularly when it pertains to Israel in both the northern and the southern kingdom, is centered around Jerusalem and all about Israel. So one presumes then that the end time will be about Jerusalem, Israel, Judah, and the grafted in church as to how they come together as the bride in the end time. And we also know that the fig tree generation that Jesus talks about, fig tree is an allegory for the southern kingdom, Judah. And I think if we're in the fig tree generation and we're starting to count down, then Judah, which is the modern day Israel, not the other 10 tribes that were lost, that will awaken for the start of the last 7 years. One of the signs that we know that we're not in the last 7 years yet is they're not awake yet and have not become visible again. But they've got control of Jerusalem since 1967. We don't know how long a generation is. It could be 120 years, as Genesis 6:3 talks about. In Psalms, it could be 70 years. And it may not have to take that full generation either. So there's lots of variables there. And we're still kind of speculating what is the start to kick off that last generation. And my speculation is likely possession of Jerusalem, because it's absolutely central to end time prophecy. The other thing is that when we look at end time prophecy in Israel and Judah, if we look at the beast empires of Daniel 7, or the metallic empires that are describing the same, and a variation on Daniel 8, which is moving Greece forward, all of which is going to make up the 7 beast empires of history, which 6 have come, the 7th is coming, and then there'll be the 8th taken over by Antichrist. So when we look at those 7 beast empires and who they are, we know of Babylon, which is the first one that's named, and they caused an apocalypse of the southern kingdom in exile. And we know that the next one that comes along and takes over from Babylon is Persia, and they're making the ability to come back and to set up a second temple. And the third one is Greece, and it's intimately involved about Israel's destiny and the setting up of the Herodian kings, starting that to be put in place. That's completed by the Romans. And you have the Roman Empire, which obviously is in the period of not only the dispersion of Israel or southern Israel, Judah, in another apocalypse, but also the crucifixion of Jesus. So if we look at what would be the two before that, it would be nations in the beast empires that were affecting Israel's history. So Egypt comes to mind as probably the first world power, and that's where Israel is born into and become a nation. And then obviously we have the Exodus. And then I kind of go between Assyria and Babel with Nimrod, who's an Antichrist type figure, and that's where the allegory for Babylon comes from. Knowing that Assyria does descend out of Nimrod and his descendants, but Assyria is the nation that and world empire that takes the northern empire and loses Israel into the nations. They totally destroy them. They take them away into slavery and then sell them into invisibility around the world. So all of the sort of historical kind of aspects of this, knowing that the four winds of prophecy are also the four winds of the empire. And that's the same as the four winds in Zechariah 5, or Zechariah 6, I mean, and that go out throughout the world, and the four winds that are the riders on the four horses of the apocalypse. So everything seems to kind of center around that. So the long answer is I think those are the reasons, and the short answer is yes, everything's about the people of destiny, and that everything is being fulfilled as we understand it through the curses of the covenant versus the blessings of the covenant, because they violated the covenant. But also written in the covenant that if they did this, they would have all of this horrible experience that they have received through slavery and enslavement, dispersion. All the things are recorded in the Holy Covenant, but that they would also be gathered and remembered in the end time. And so, yes, it has to be about that, but it also has to be about not just visible Judah, but it has to be about lost Israel to bring them back in, and also the church, so that they'll be wedded together as the bride into the same covenant by the time of Armageddon. So if you want to understand more about how that's going to come back about on the Israel and Judah side, you need to factor in the resurrection of Ezekiel 37 with the dry bones, and the Exodus that happens in the teens in Ezekiel 37. So a little bit of a detailed answer, but I think it's really good to understand some of these things as we talk about end time prophecy.
When people talk about World War III, Israel is named a lot, not always, but many people do. And it seems to me that, well, at least for the moment, China and Russia, especially when it comes to the technological aspects, they have very, very good relations. Do you think that that might change and it has to change, or does that not play a role?
Well, I think the geopolitical scenario needs to be in place. So if we're going to look at Ezekiel 38 and 39 for the Gog War, we know a few things about it. We know that in Ezekiel 38, that it talks about being the last days. So it's in the last 7 years. And we also know that in Ezekiel 39 it happens before Second Exodus. And Second Exodus is a last 3.5 year event. So you have this massive war, and you have this massive alliance, and you have this alliance of Persia, which is more than just Iran, and it's Iraq, and it's literally the Persian people of old, right? So the Persians were also influential in migration into India and into the East, not to be confused with the kings of the East in the Armageddon War, right? But understand that this understanding of who Persia is could be a greater alliance of people than what people first sort of anticipate. We also know that the Russians are there. And we also know that Gomer is there, and that's thought to be parts of Middle Europa. And of course, the Scythians of Gog and Magog, and understand Gog isn't a individual named in the Bible in the Table of Nations. Magog is, and Gog is of Magog, and Gog was a offspring of Iapetus or Poseidon, depending on which version that you're reading of that, who was a giant. And so you've got Russia that is established through the migration of the Scythians. You've got Gomer moving northward. You've got also places like Libya in North Africa. You've got this huge alliance of people. And so what is the exact timing of that? Because a lot of people think that is actually Armageddon. A lot of people, when it happens, will think it's Armageddon. It's actually the counterfeit Armageddon that Antichrist will take credit for winning and come to power on. And so Gog, as you take that back, both in Greek and both in Hebrew, coming out of the Bible, is also an end time Antichrist type figure. So you have to remember that Jesus said, both in the epistles of John and in Matthew 24, that there will be many antichrists plural, and that the Antichrist ideology has been around since, at least since the flood, probably before, and has been part of the beast empires, that they're trying to always bring about Antichrist beforehand, which again, why I would include Babel and Nimrod as combined into Assyria as that first empire, because he is having universal sway as an archetypical Antichrist figure at the time of Babel. So when we look at multiple Antichrists, that means that we could be easily deceived. And Antichrist is going to need a counterfeit Armageddon to come to power on, because he's going to try and counterfeit everything Jesus does, including the resurrection, which is why he receives a mortal head wound in Revelation 13. So what's the timing of this? We know it's in the end time, probably in the first half of the last 7 years. Daniel 9:27 lays out a covenant that Antichrist will negotiate for Babylon, which is 7 years. And in the middle, he comes to power at the abomination. So if he writes the power on that, it's probably going to be a little bit before that. So we need to factor in what is the other prophecies that will talk about this, that talk about the Gog War, but isn't the Armageddon War. So if we look at Revelation 9, you have the opening of the abyss, and then you get the 200 million man army. Revelation 9 happens before the midpoint of the last 7 years. How do we know that? Other than the linear nature in which it's laid out, is the one who comes up from the abyss is going to kill the two witnesses whose commission was for 3.5 years. They're part of those who are going to preach the gospel in the first 3.5 years that Jesus is laying out with this chronology in Matthew 24. And we also know that this is a 200 million man army. This seems to be the Armageddon army. This is what everybody thinks, and when they read Revelations, that is Armageddon, but it doesn't fit in terms of the other prophecies. But if you look at Joel 1 and 2, and you look at these hybrid type of creatures that are in this army, it's kind of identical. But Joel 1 and 2 isn't Armageddon. That's a separate war as it's laid out in Joel 1 and 2, and it's the greatest army ever seen. And Joel 3 begins the Armageddon War, which happens after Joel 1 and 2. So everything sort of lines up that you've got this great Armageddon-like war that is there to bring Antichrist to power and to deceive the people that he is Antichrist because he's going to come in promising peace. And in Luke 21, this is the point where he surrounds the army, surrounds Jerusalem with his army, and the next verse goes into the abomination. So pretty much just before the midpoint. And this is the overwhelming army that's talked about in Daniel 11 that is swept away before Antichrist. So I think that's what we have to look at when we look at that Gog War, is not only who the players are, but when it fits, so that it helps us understand what's going to happen. And I also think that in Ezekiel 39, when it chooses Gog and Magog, that's chosen for a reason. That not only is it representing a significant portion of the alliance that are the kings of Russia, but it is also signaling that there could be a demonic and or a angelic influence to this army that's leading it. And I think it's directly related to the abyss being opened, where not only you have Abaddon Apollyon coming out as the king of the abyss, the one who's going to kill the two witnesses, but we also have fallen angels coming with them. And then in Ezekiel 32, not to lose people, it talks about the terrible ones, and the terrible ones is a term that's used throughout the Old Testament for the Rephaim kings, the kings of the beast empires that we talked about, the ones who did terrible things on the earth, who were slain and now are in the sides of the abyss. I think these are the worst of the Nephilim and the Rephaim that are locked alongside their procreators in the abyss, knowing there are other ones that aren't in the abyss, as witnessed by Jesus encountering those demons like Legion in his time, that these ones will also be released, but they're going to need an oikaterion or a dwelling place for that spirit to interact within the world. So just as demons try and possess a body, even though it's a war going on between themselves and the host spirit, that's the only way they can get rest and interact in this world. And oikaterion is that word that is translated as house in heaven, or dwelling place for the spirit as it's defined as, and the habitation that the fallen angels left to commit the sins during the time of the flood and to create these giants. And so just as angels need to create an oikaterion, a body and a soul for their spirit as a dwelling place for the spirit to interact physically in the world, and obviously how they create the DNA to create the offspring, the Nephilim giants from that, so do the demons when they no longer have a body, because when their bodies died, their spirits weren't permitted to go to sleep like humans go to sleep, and they weren't permitted into heaven. So they either went to the abyss or they roam. And if you understand that, that's why they teach all the descendants of the giants and into mysticism how to navigate the underworld, right? So that they're not going to go to the abyss, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So it's part of that whole recreation sort of, not recreation, but reincarnation theology that they have. That's just sort of centered around these wandering demonic spirits. So if Gog was the offspring of Poseidon or Iapetus, and he was in the Nephilim rebellion as recorded in Greek mythology, and went to Tartarus or the abyss, then he's going to need a body if he's going to lead that war. And again, I know that's a very long answer. I'll try and shorten some of these answers down as we go. But I think he's going to be involved as being this incarnation aspect that globalism talks about and Gnostics talk about, which is, like Vishnu incarnating into Buddha, right, to provide more power. He's going to either incarnate into another human, which I don't think is likely, or he's probably going to have a body provided for him, as in a clone or something like that.
Okay, let's go briefly back to the situation where Oh, I don't expect you to explain that again. We did an entire interview about the bloodline families and how they are all fighting for that position, the hopefuls of being the Antichrist. But during that time, when that is really taking place, meaning you have several hopefuls, and then there can only be one. And so that, to me, it sounds like a very, very confusing time.
Yes.
And it also sounds to me as if, the bloodline families might start throwing dirt at each other.
Absolutely.
And that, on the other hand, could lead to, people picking sides.
Yes.
And I think that would be wrong.
Well, I think that's exactly what's going to happen. When you look at all the different cultures and religions, they talk about this Messiah in their religions, whether or not it's Lord Maitreya, whether or not it's the Mahdi, on and on and on. They all have this type of individual that they're looking for. You have bloodlines all around the world, so you have rivals. And these bloodlines who make up the 10 kings that Babylon is going to bring about, that starts the last 7 years, they're going to know the time is short, right? So 10 of them may be looking at saying, how do I become that one? And there may be other ones that weren't included in the 10 who are still within those empires operating countries who may be causing trouble. And so Christians and the world as a whole needs to be very, very careful of just pointing to this is Antichrist, that is Antichrist, because it's going to completely degrade the credibility of the people who are saying that, and everybody associated with them, and will be part of the ability to move these naysayers against the global state off as mundane, not worthy of being part of it, and to more easily justify as subhumans or sub-beings that aren't going to evolve into godhood to create genocides. And I think this is going to be what I call in the rapture tragedy in my book, a shaming of the saints when the world needs them the most. And even when Antichrist is first recognized, there'll still all be these other rivals. So even though he might negotiate and will negotiate this world covenant that permits the Jewish people to start their sacrifices again on a wing or an extremity or overspreading of the temple for the first 3.5 years, even though a lot of people will say that's Antichrist, he's not Antichrist yet, not until he's crowned in the temple, as what you stated earlier, which is the abomination, and declares himself to be God, as 2 Thessalonians 2 talks about, which fits perfectly overlaying the chronology that Jesus talks about and the linear nature to what happens between Revelation 6 and Revelation 14. It lays things out sort of perfectly in a chronology there. And so people will have to be very, very careful, because there'll be other antichrists who will be in power. Antichrist isn't the king yet. He's not part of the 10. He's the 8th king. He's the 8th empire. So I would look at it, and the 10 kings, not 9, the 10 kings hand their power over to the Antichrist at the midpoint of the last 7 years, Revelation 17, so that they can destroy Babylon, who they grow jealous of because of all the wealth that she's created, controlling everything. And that's when he crowns himself as God at the midpoint. So there'll be Antichrist, like perhaps this Gog figure from that Revelation war, but expect other ones who have come along before. So everybody's going to be watching the shiny object of the Antichrist wannabes and not keeping their eye on this rising Antichrist who will be shamed for saying, yes, he is, no, he isn't, and pointing to all of these other ones. And we see that going on today, because whether or not it's a leader of the United States or another leader around the world, let's say like Macron, that was accused of being Antichrist.
Yeah.
You know, you make enough predictions and you're wrong, nobody ever believes you again. And I don't think you ought to make predictions at all. You ought to lay out, you can speculate.
Yeah, but then
say you're
say
speculating.
that you're speculating.
Exactly. And say, this is what I think, but don't be thinking that you're a prophet or you're ordained to give this, because it's only going to be more destructive to the people who need to have their voices heard. But I don't believe that's going to happen until we get into the last 7 years, and then it's going to be genocide, even though there's going to be great testimonies that are going to be going on as people are filled with the Holy Spirit to do so. But it's going to be a bit too late.
Yeah, I noticed this when I was preparing for this interview, that, yeah, once again, you have a couple of channels. Well, Gary, just for your information, the tribulation starts next year. Yeah.
Yep.
And
everybody always likes to get ahead of the chronology that's laid out. And you know, for people, if they're interested in terms of how I come about trying to understand prophecy and make everything fit without, you know, running into those contradictions, which is difficult if your approach doesn't including all of the passages and then making them fit without manipulating them. I have a little document I send out people. It's my 10 bullet points on how I approach prophecy. And so if anybody wants it, you get a hold of me, I'll send it to you. At least you'll know how I come from my perspective. Yeah. And so, but one of the things is that everything has to fit, and you can't ignore the inconvenient passages.
Yeah.
And so what a lot of people do is they ignore the inconvenient passages when they're making these specific dates, because certain events haven't happened yet that have to be in place.
I remember in 2011, there was a group of people that were expecting the rapture, more or less, and actually they made videos, and then they had quit their jobs.
Yes.
And they were meeting, and basically sitting there waiting. And
and
now it's 2021.
Yeah,
I mean,
still hasn't happened.
Wow.
And then a few years ago, you had astrology coming into play. Why Christians would believe in astrology? They think it's astronomy, but it's astrology is what they're being fed. That the astrological alignments, as it overlays on the zodiac of astrology, you had this so-called woman that was positioned in Revelation 12, and obviously the rapture was about to happen. Well, you can't jump through all of the first 3.5 years of the last 7 years and say, well, it didn't matter that those events didn't happen, but rapture is going to happen now using Revelation 12. And the marker in Revelation 12 is the abomination time of Judea fleeing to the wilderness to be protected, and the 3.5 years that's outlined that they're going to be protected from Antichrist and Satan. And then Antichrist and Satan will turn on all of those who are fusing the mark, all of those who uphold the testimony of Jesus, and will be persecuting them, which is the last 3.5 years, and again after the mark and after Antichrist comes to power. So, I mean, you just can't ignore all of the details. I know they do, and they ought not to, but people listening to them have to test them. And you have to test them by saying, how does that fit with all of the other prophecies?
So now when we watch certain movies about this subject, the rise of the Antichrist, then one thing is striking. A lot of movies have this character coming out of the European Union. And yeah, okay, you could argue, yeah, that's Hollywood. But does that make any sense to you? Why always Europe?
Well, because they
the
look
old
at,
bloodlines are there?
yeah.
Okay.
So here's how I think they get there with that is, and I disagree with it because it's a little bit too limited in my opinion in terms of their purview on it and how they're looking at it. So the end time empire is going to be the rise of the Roman Empire. We know that from prophecy. And we know that there was this Holy Roman Empire that became this very popular thing with the Bloodlines, who are carrying that title, have the Kings of Jerusalem title. Right. So the Europeans are going to have some bloodlines that are going to be rivals. To me, there's no question about that. But that doesn't mean that it comes from the European community. If you look at it from how prophecy describes things, is that the Roman Empire was more than Europe. The Roman Empire that he will rise up in and become the 8th king over, included not only Europe, but it included the Middle East, it included Greece, it included Egypt, and it included parts of Persia. So it's a very large area if Antichrist were to come out of that sort of interpretation. And I think we need to be cognizant of that. That's the likelihood where he might come from. But if you factor in Daniel 8, and Daniel 8 gets to the 7 empires in a different way than Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. And that matches up with Revelation 13 and 17. So Daniel 8 is talking about the Greek Empire and Alexander, and he's the first king in this prophecy. And that empire splits into 4 entities after that. There's 4 generals that are going to take over. That gets you to 5. Rome is part of that, and they take over. That comes to 6. And then Antichrist is thought to come out of that. So it's not that Daniel 8 is in conflict with Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. It is a dual prophecy. It's adding more information, and that this Antichrist figure tends to have some sort of relationship to Alexander, who, in the Quran, they actually considered him a Antichrist type figure. And I don't disagree with that, because I think all of the Beast Empire kings were Antichrist type figures. Would come out of Alexander's empire. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to come out of Greece, because again, Greece was this huge empire, right? So we need to be cognizant that that might be a location where it comes from, but that Greek empire didn't really include parts of Europe. So that part's missing, except for Greece included Rome. So if you were going to say, okay, I'm going to get that dogmatic on it, you'd have to kind of say Rome. And that might be a possibility, but it could come from Persia. It could come from North Africa. It could come from any part of the Greek or the Roman Empire. So again, we have to be careful of that, because it's there to help guide us. But we're not going to be told who Antichrist is. We're not told who Antichrist is. We're just given important pieces of information as we get into that time, who he might be. And again, getting ahead of chronology is problematic. But there's no doubt that the bloodlines in Europe believe they have the King of Jerusalem title, and that they first crowned themselves that after taking Jerusalem by the Knights Templar, which had, were made up of the Anjou family, the de Bouillon, the Payan, descended from the Merovingians, and then this Anjou bloodline is the one that gets crowned King of Jerusalem in 1118, whether it's Baldwin I or Baldwin II, depending on which version that you're reading, but they're all related. And then that Anjou bloodline shifts into 2 or 3 different bloodlines, obviously all rivals to that Antichrist figure. So you have a southern Roman and Mediterranean connection to that bloodline, or you have the current king of Jerusalem, which comes through the Anjou of Lorraine region of de Paon, de Bouillon, and Anjou, that married into the Habsburg as the Habsburg Lorraine and carried the king of Jerusalem title, and then into Spain, where it was taken over by King Philip, and or Juan Carlos and his son King Philip has that title today. So they're definitely going to be vying for that, but what we don't know is will they be the one, because there's many bloodlines out there.
Yeah, we will see.
We will see.
So now when I imagine that moment in time when the Antichrist actually enters the stage and will be crowned and so on and so forth, I can't imagine him. I guess it's pretty safe to say it will be a male. I can't imagine him coming in with a whimper. Yeah, like, let's say, oh yeah, we have this wonderful new political party, and yeah, here is the manifest, and here's our program, and this is what we want to do. No. I imagine him coming in with a bang, something like, hi guys, I just eradicated world hunger, or hey, I stopped World War III from happening. How you like that? Something that is really lifting a lot of anxiety. What would you say?
Well, for sure, he is going to be right from the point and maybe even before, when he starts to raise his profile. He negotiates this covenant. So he's going to become less unknown at that point. And then for the next 3.5 years, he's going to be rising in popularity. He's going to be sort of the so-called reasonable adult in the room. He's going to be doing good things, and he's going to be gaining popularity. And I think World War III is the Gog War that we talked about previous, is that point in time where he can now move very quickly. And Daniel talks about he's going to overthrow 3 of the 10. So he's going to usurp 3, and then he's going to distribute the plunder. So one presumes he's going to overthrow the 3 wealthiest groups of nations and redistribute that around the world. And that's going to go over well. He's going to come in offering peace. He's going to come in and saying, I have the answers. And what he does once he takes power, just as what he did just before he got into power, whatever he said and is doing is working, right? And so he's going to promise not only peace and safety, but he's going to promise prosperity and a completely new system. And he's going to announce, this is the millennium. I am the Christ. I am the Fourth Reich. I am the one who is going to give you 1,000-year reign with my dynasty, or with me living that long. We don't know quite how that's going to play out, because we're not told that. But what we do know is that he's going to move quickly, and they're going to love him. And they're all going to wander after him in adoration. Also in adoration of a false resurrection, because he receives a mortal head wound on this rise to power, and yet did not die. And they're going to say, who is like him? No one is like him. And he's going to say things that are unheard of. He is going to say things that are going to reinvent how people understand scripture, how they understand the world. He's going to do and say things that is going to reinvent all economy in terms of different aspects of it. He is going to say things that sound like he could only be the true Messiah. That's how strong he's going to be. And he's going to have all the power of the dragon, as Revelation talks about, given to him so that he can do things. He's going to be an incarnation either of Satan or the Watcher Azazel, I kind of go back in between because of the connection to Abaddon and Apollyon, but Revelation 13 is very, very specific on the dragon, although Azazel was a seraphim as well. So is the dragon that's talked about in Revelation 13 the same one in Revelation 12? Probably. So maybe he's receiving power from both. We don't know. But what we do know, he does receive power from the dragon, who is likely Satan. That's described in Revelation 12 as the dragon and the serpent. So he's going to have this magical power. And he's going to have the false prophet, who is the counterfeit Elijah, who is doing all of these great miracles on his behalf to set the table. So people are going to say, this is it. He's going to look like the answer to every problem.
Mm.
So, and he comes to power quickly after the war.
Okay. So there will be a war.
There needs to be a counterfeit Armageddon, and I think that's that Gog war we're talking about.
Okay. And other politicians, media, will they call them Messiah as well?
Yes, yes. The whole world, not part of the world, the whole world, and all of the organizational structure that has been put in place before has been set, I'm speaking in the past, will have been set up and will be set up to allow Antichrist to assume power with very quickly by taking care of three, destroying Babylon and declaring himself the Messiah. And so that means they're going to have the media that's in place. That means they're going to have the education in place. That means they're going to have the religion in place. They're going to have the economic system in place. Antichrist figures in the past, whether or not people want to look at Adolf Hitler as one of Nostradamus's Antichrist, and or Napoleon, and or any of the beast kings, they could not take the world by force. It's just, even in the modern time, it just takes too long and too bloody and too much resistance. And so, I mean, before the modern times, it was they couldn't manage an empire larger than what they expanded to. And most of the ancient empires were pretty similar in size because they just couldn't, cover that geography with the technology in place to do it. So they couldn't actually get a full world empire, right? Just like maybe the known Western world empire as opposed to the world empire. But in this case, if everything is set up for you, and all you have to do is usurp that seat of authority, then it's done, right? It happens that fast.
Mm. Yeah, we will talk later on a little bit about these specific steps, one world religion, one world currency, and what have you. Are there certain aspects that might happen after he has been crowned?
Aspects to Antichrist?
Yeah, what has to come together? Yeah, there are certain steps, events that lead to his
rising, yeah.
And
So
might there be something that we expect to happen before he comes to power, which actually might happen after he has been crowned?
well, you need to have technology rise to a level that can support what he's going to do. So we see that developing in a lot of different lanes of science and technology, whether or not it is Bitcoin for an advanced AI type of dominated world system. And so I think we're seeing the preliminary technology to that type of cashless society that's going to require that mark. That's still developing in its technology. I think you're having a medical system that is ramping up in another lane of technology that is going to be able to provide health and longevity. Davos, I think in 2017, said that the high level of AI combination of quantum computing implant system going into the body will be delivered through the healthcare system so that people can be vaccinated, given all of their vitamins, give long life. That will also be connected into this AI sort of system because people will demand it, because there'll be contrived catastrophes like pandemics and wars and things like that. So that is being developed, and those are all separate lanes, and there's several lanes within that have to be developed. You have to be able to affect the DNA through that type of healthcare system. You have to have it working in multiple universes, so you need that quantum computing aspect of it, and you have to have that access to knowledge, because in the polytheist belief system, to be a god in the physical world, you have to have immortality and access to knowledge, because it's a knowledge cult. So that all has to be part of it. You have to have a world government. So if that's not in place, then Antichrist isn't going to be coming. So that comes along first, because he comes halfway through the 10 kings, which develops. So that has to be in place. You can't have world government, sorry to keep going, but you can't have world government without Babylon, because Babylon brings this together. You're not going to have a universal religion that gains access over all of the economic system, which develops that beast system. And beast is more than just Antichrist, it's more than just the empires, but it's also the system that's being developed. And you have Babylon, who's going to require its false prophets and catastrophes of doom and catastrophes, so that it can rise and it can actually predict these through its prophets, these catastrophes, to gain credibility, to get everybody to convert. Because nobody can imagine today how you could have a universal religion when they are so far apart, no matter how they talk. So it has to be done through the catastrophes of the birth pangs, getting quicker and tougher and contrived so that they can predict them. And you have to have those false prophets first. So you have to have Babylon rise first. So that needs to be in place. So you have to have a continuation of religions talking. You have to have a continuation of bringing in organizations and things that go transnational. And then you have to have catalyst moments that are going to push these along fairly quickly. From a prophetic side, when you understand birth pangs, which is the beginning of sorrows in Matthew 24, they are wars, rumors of wars, pestilence, famine, and earthquakes. And they get stronger as they go, so that these are the same catastrophes in the seal judgments that bring about 25% destruction and death, 33% getting stronger again with the trumpets, and then 100% for the wrath bowls, except that Jesus shortens the days and it's not permitted to destroy the whole earth and all of the people on it. And so we're going to need to see in place more of these birth pangs starting to happen. And they work in conjunction as they get stronger with the false prophets. So they start to merge together before the start of the last 7 years, when the seals are going to be opened either just before or just after, and I think just before.
I'm not questioning here your chronology. I'm just thinking, wouldn't it, if this charismatic figure, the Antichrist, if his tricks work and people experience something like miracles and so on and so forth, wouldn't it be easier to install him first?
Sure.
And then, because people are so impressed, they will say, oh, yes, please, world government, and you are the one. And yes, we will have a world current. you know, my feeling is that people would nod it off much easier than with such a character in place than without it.
Yeah, I mean, you can easily imagine something like that you don't need Babylon for that to happen, right? Except that you do have Babylon. So you have to deal with it. How does it fit? Right? So, and if you look at Babylon, it's going to be ruled by the, bloodlines, right? Because they controlled all the religions with the bloodlines, and just as they controlled the kings and the queens. So they're not going to give up, they're not going to want to give up their power as easily, right? And I think that becomes one of those conflicts where between the 10 kings and Antichrist, who destroy Babylon and replace Babylon with a new god and a new religion, worshiping him and Satan as gods, right? So there's that friction. And even though even though Antichrist is there before Babylon rises, he may be younger, and he is just gaining some fame through the negotiation of the covenant, but he won't be full Antichrist by this point. And he still is going to have to build that reputation, and he still has to receive that mortal head wound, and he still needs a counterfeit Armageddon. So things have to be put in place on his rise to power. But the pushback and the rivalry will create all of this. So who would kill Antichrist? Well, Christians might kill him. It might be staged, or it might be a rival, right? But, if you can imagine what would happen if, let's say, a king of Camelot would receive a mortal head wound like President Kennedy, and he was, quite adored at that time, but not a full Antichrist figure, but then came back to life. That would really, set him off as a legitimate Christ figure, pulling off a resurrection. And I think it's a fake resurrection, but however it's done, he's going to need to counterfeit Jesus's resurrection and discount Jesus's resurrection and replace Jesus, because he's the counterfeit Christ.
Yeah.
So I think you need to have those things sort of happen, right? But your point's legitimate. Like, why does it need to happen in that order as opposed to this order? Only from a Christian perspective that I'm biased towards, obviously, is because there's these other events that says have to be happening as well.
So now let's get a feeling for where we are. And I'm going to share the screen here and start here. So the Abrahamic family house. And this is in Abu Dhabi. And this is, it has been initiated after Pope Francis visited Abu Dhabi. If memory serves, this here will be the mosque. This here, it is the synagogue, and this is totally like a cube, yeah? Some articles point that out, the cube architecture, which is a nod towards Saturn, but we know that some Jews, they also wear that black cube on their forehead, and this will be the church. And interestingly enough, here, I found that a little bit amusing. It says here, the Abrahamic family house will host a variety of programming and events. Yeah, you will be programmed there, all right.
Yeah, nice choice of words. So I think this is again sort of a sign that we're not totally given in the Bible, but it's a sign of the times where not only will you have rival Babylon centers, which I think is Rome for a lot of reasons, but you will also have rival Jerusalems as the various bloodlines around the family and religions are positioning to be the one that's going to be running the world at the end time.
Yeah.
So I think I think that makes sense with the rivalries.
Yeah. And on the other hand, we have this happening, mass killings of Christians in the DRC, in the Congo, a neglected tragedy. Yeah, that's correct. You have an attack on a mosque, every media station will report.
Cover it. Yep.
Yeah, 100 Christians get hacked to death. Nobody could care less. Yeah?
Yep.
So you see what I mean? On the one hand, we have this effort. Yeah, look, guys, we are all this one Abrahamic family. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for it, yeah, to stop wars over religion. My God is stronger than yours. No, mine is stronger, and nonsense like that. And on the other hand, yeah, you have the harsh reality that, yeah, actually that's a nice idea, but it does not reflect reality. So where would you say are we in that sense, though, with the one word religion?
Yeah, and again, you know, I'll go back to the birth pangs. So this is part of the birth pangs, and specifically, as in the King James Version Bible, it has right after the birth pangs, you have this affliction that he's warning us about. And affliction is the Greek word translated into English as affliction, but the Greek word is Philippes. Philippes is the word that is also used to translate tribulation. So the King James Version Bible isn't consistent as it ought to be, because that same word will show up after the midpoint where you have the tribulation of the world. But they specifically use affliction there instead of tribulation, but it's describing tribulation. And so what we need to understand is that all the calamities will get greater as we go, even the tribulation. And the New Testament is very, very consistent in talking about that all Christians will have to go through tribulation. Some are going to go through worse tribulation than others. And then beginning in Revelation 2:8-9, it is talking about going through tribulation for 10 days. So just as in Daniel 9:27, and Revelation works very, very well with Revelation and the same sort of types of measurement times, where 1 week is 7 years, the last 7 years. Now you have in Revelation, before the seal openings, you have tribulation for 10 days. So you have a tribulation that's going to begin before the seals of 3 years, if you do a day as a year. And this tribulation is not as strong as the tribulation of the saints that's described, the tribulation of the saints in Revelation 7. And these are the ones who are martyred for the testimony of Jesus after Babylon has come to power. And these are the same ones that those martyrs, like them, were raised in Revelation 6. So there's, in the resurrections, there's Jesus, the first fruits, which these are first fruits. That include the 144,000 in Revelation 14 that talks about them as first fruits and shown in heaven. So we assume by that deduction, even though it doesn't say specifically, but first fruits are martyred, they're in heaven. One presumes that they're martyred. They're told to wait for, the ones in Revelation 6 are told to wait a little longer. So those who are martyred in the name of Jesus, like they were, will also be martyred. And these are the ones that come out of the great tribulation, the word Philippes. And these are the ones that are martyred in the first 3.5 years. The tribulation of the last 3.5 years is one that's not seen since the beginning of the world. This is the tribulation of the world, that there will be destruction and again more genocide for those who don't take the mark of the beast or worship Satan or worship Antichrist. But it will be even more horrific of a tribulation than the one in Revelation 7 that Jesus is describing in Matthew 24, 8-9, and is more horrific than the tribulation in the 3 days before with the rise of Babylon, and more horrific than the tribulation that is going on in the birth pangs. So if you understand birth pangs and the linear nature of that, and you understand the linear nature of Revelation, you can start to get an understanding of how these major events are going to start to take place. So this is the seeds of the genocide that's coming.
Mhm.
And all of those, not just so that people don't misunderstand me, all of those who will oppose Babylon, all of those who will oppose Antichrist, whether they're Christian or not, are going to be persecuted.
So if we have rivalry, who will be the Jerusalem? Yeah, I could see Abu Dhabi, for instance,
Yeah.
aspiring to that.
Yep.
that-
I hear a lot of cities, and I can't remember all the different names, and that are being advertised as the new Babylon, right? There are brand new cities being built for that aspect. And I think we're going to hear more of that as we go.
Mhm. For what aspect?
To be the new world center.
Okay.
So, and if you understand, there's two centers of the world in the last 7 years. There's one where Babylon is located for the first 3.5 years, and probably a few years before that. And that's destroyed by Antichrist in one day completely. I mean, it's totally destroyed. So presumably nuclear or more advanced type of technology obliterates it completely in Revelation 17, and 18 is where you get the destruction details. And then you have Antichrist setting up in Jerusalem, which is figuratively called Sodom. And it's the same place where the two witnesses are going to be killed in Revelation 11, who also, their commission is for 3.5 years. So they're killed at the midpoint. Just as in Revelation 14:6, you have the summary coming for the last 3.5 years after the 144,000 who started in Revelation 7:1 at the midpoint, 3.5 years. So everything sort of comes together at that point in time, and then transitions into that next tribulation after that. So you have the tribulation of 3 years before, it transitions into the opening of the seals in Babylon and into that 3.5 year period. So yeah, that's how, to me, that's sort of how it all kind of fits and comes together.
So when I'm listening to you, what has to happen before the big show?
Yeah.
And
A lot.
one, yeah,
A
one
lot.
might have the impression, yeah, actually, I have a feeling we are light years away from that. Then again, the last 18 months have probably taught us that some things
can move quickly and
very
cause
quickly. Do you think this is a
event
test run to see if we, you know, what percentage on average it is where people roll over and just obey and believe everything that they are being told, or
they're not as close as they want to be yet. So it's going to take a few more things. And so when I say there's a lot more things to happen, look at it as echoes. It's the same events that are repeating, only stronger to get you closer to that. So it's going to look like the end, but not everything is in place, and the events aren't as strong as the ones that are predicted. So, you know, as we get a pandemic like COVID, we're going to see more pandemics, and they're going to be worse. And just as these catastrophes have to happen, they're going to be contrived. They're going to be planned to bring things about, to cattle herd people into these events. So expect more contrived catastrophes to start working that sound like, and a lot of people will say this is the end when they happen, but it doesn't fit yet in terms of the damage that they're going to do. And people are going to think that whatever happens with the seal openings with the war that permits the 10 kings in Babylon to come to power is going to be Armageddon. And in fact, even a lot of the people who are ruling the earth are going to think like that, because in Revelation 6, they actually go into the caves thinking this is the day of the Lord's wrath has come when they didn't expect it. So we have to understand that it's going to look like the end, but it's not until we go through all of the events that need to come into place. So we need to have a universal religion first, and we need to have our technology get to a level where you can deceive people enough to take on the God of all things, to promise immortality that can link you into this Borg hive system, that can link you into this mark of the beast system, that you have an ability to unite through catastrophes. And prophecy is also move forward through catastrophes, and things move forward very, very quickly. So if you look at a lot of the prophetic events, there's catastrophes that are part of that makes all of that happen. And you have to have this universal religion, which is, to me, the most difficult thing to bring about.
Yeah.
And you can only do that through putting the world through all of these catastrophes and multiple catastrophes to a point where they're prepared to accept this whole system through faith, which is the Babylon entrance onto the table. And they'll have the false prophets, and we'll be promising a similar type of millennium that Antichrist is going to promise, because it's the same kind of thing, but not quite yet for Antichrist.
Yeah. I wonder a lot about that, how they are going to bring that one about, because some people say, they will just replace it with the New Age religion. I'm not so sure if it's that
you just can't do it that way. It's just not enough.
Yeah.
What you need is false prophets. Now, I don't know whether this is the one, because I think there's going to be, again, competing factions and different religions that might be doing similar things. So if people are familiar with Catholicism and visions of Mary that have happened with Fatima and Lourdes, there was an interesting one, which I'm sure a lot of Europeans are very familiar with, called Medjugorje, that happened in the 90s. And this to me is a template, whether it's this or it's other ones or it's all of them. 6 children were initiated by the apparition of Mary, whom they could only see. They would be in a trance-like state, and she would be preparing them, initiating them to get ready for their great commission that they have been given the day that they are to come out. And their commission, as they wrote about in the books that they gave us information on, that were put into books, is that on a certain day they will come out. They have 10 prophecies to provide the world. And they are prophecies of doom, that this calamity will happen unless the whole world converts to the true religion.
Like a punishment?
Yes, if you don't convert, this catastrophe is going to happen, and you risk destroying ourselves from the face of the earth, just like in Babylon, or in Babel, I mean. Now, we don't know whether or not they're going to be linked in with science, but I think they're going to be linked in with science as well. Just as science is giving us these catastrophe warnings by certain dates, right? But these aren't the false prophets yet. They are the precursors to the false prophets. Again, look at it as echoes getting stronger as you go of the same type of events. So they will have 10 that they are prepared to do to convert the whole world. And as it goes, the catastrophes get worse. So you have false prophets who can predict disasters around the world that affects the whole world. And if you don't convert to our true religion, you will scare people into accepting that. And then those catastrophes would stop for a certain period of time. So Babylon can come to power. So I would expect, again, rivals on that to a certain degree of the false prophets and the prophecies of doom. And the only way they can make that really happen is either contrived ones that they're actually planning them and setting them off, like creating viruses and mutating them to be spread around the world as one. Technology that can create earthquakes that they're busily working on, and earthquakes are increasing as we speak, and there's a lot of things going on in the earth that they're doing that may be causing that. And you get wars, which are always planned and contrived, and out of that you're also going to get more pandemics, and you're also going to get famine out of that, because as you destroy the world's economy, as you start wars, as you have pandemics, you can't feed the world. Right. So you have all of those that will start working together. And that's what really needs to start to happen is you need to have all of that going on in conjunction with these figures that are saying this is what's going to happen, or you can convert to the true religion.
So now I don't know of any religious book that is talking about that we all have to unite in one religion, or otherwise we will be so badly punished that we will cease to exist. That will be really interesting how they are going to do that.
Well, to me, they're going to have additional support from fallen angels, right?
Okay.
I think that has to be sort of in that mix.
So, in other words, fallen angel technology as well?
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that ramp up of technology now, just as when you had in the antediluvian epoch, the 7 sciences of Enoch, son of Cain, merging with the illicit knowledge from heaven. At the same time, the Nephilim appear on the earth in their creation. You create that whole organizational structure to take over the whole world, and they paraded that world into destruction. So I think we're seeing that similar ramp up of technology now.
So if the one world government has must come to pass before the Antichrist can appear, I can imagine a lot of quarrel about that as well.
Oh yeah.
You know, who's going to be the big honcho here?
Yeah, and we're seeing that today, and they don't even have the 10 yet. They've got, as the Club of Rome has set out in 1968 to early 70s, they've divided the world into 10 groups of nations. Now, whether or not that's the final look or not, because I think there's going to be that jockeying of position. But if we look at, it's not in place today, but what's echoing what's going to happen, you have places like Russia with Putin, and you have Xi in China who are saying, I'm not buying into the world order, the Nephilim world order, as I like to call it, in the same way the Europeans see it and the Americans see it. We see a new world order, which we agree with,
led by us.
Led by us, or in the meantime, that as it comes together, we just want a larger role.
Yeah.
So you pacify those other forces that Putin dynasty gets their old dynasty that includes all of the Baltic states back, all of the Ukraine, whatever else that they want to pacify them. They get that bigger plate, that bigger geography, that old empire, and just as China wants basically all of Southeast Asia, and we're not sure how far that they're going to be permitted to take, and that they will have an important role. I think within the 10, there's probably going to be a smaller circle, maybe 5, maybe 3. And I'm only saying maybe 5 is because the 10 kings show up on 10 toes, right? On 2 different legs. So there could be an inner circle to the power of the 10. And that will have more influence, sort of like what you have the Security Council at the UN today, where you have all of the nation members, but you have that internal security council that, has veto power and things like that.
And interestingly enough, both Xi and Putin, they have both convinced the others that it would be good for the country if they can rule until they die.
Yes, it's an amazing thing, isn't it? That they have completely changed their system to account for themselves. So whether or not it's them or an offspring from them, one would imagine that that will be how sort of things sort of play out. Just as, if people said, well, what do you think, is Trump an Antichrist figure? I mean, well, he's a little old, right? So he may not be the one, but if he were to be in power, and if he were to say, I want to be in power for a long time, then one of his sons would rise and be that figure. And again, look for, as this thing is coming together, for that being set up in places where you've got that being, controlled by one individual. And then he'll transition it into not just, I've got control till I die, but this is a transgenerational bloodline dynasty.
I think that will be the next step. They actually will, behave like kings. Emperor.
Well, because they believe they are.
Of course.
And they have the genealogy to do that. Like Xi goes back to the Shah dynasty of kings that produced all of the empires of the kings. And Xi and Shah, it's the etymological sort of evolution of Shah into Xi, and he's part of the Li family. That was the Shah dynasty, and they were created by the dragon kings and the dragon gods. So this is the same thing. The Putyanins were the original czars out of the Ukraine, where Putin comes from out of nowhere. His family's name, Putin, doesn't have a record beyond about 1850, as my memory recalls. With his grandfather, comes out of nowhere. But what there was a tradition in Russia where the royal families, if they had, and Ukraine, and understand that the czars that originally ran Moscow until about the 1600s, when the Romanovs came into power, were the bloodlines out of the Kiev dynasty. Right, it was a branch dynasty, and Putyanins were still around in the time of Putin's grandfather. So, if they had an offspring outside of the legitimate marriage, they wouldn't give that offspring the full name, but they would give them part of the name. And so, it's thought that that's where Putin gets his name from, is the Putyanin royal bloodline. And why he has such a strong interest in getting the Ukraine back, because that's where he's from and that's where his bloodline comes from.
So now another step is one world currency.
Yep.
And here I have something about China again, because China in May of this year, at the International Finance Forum in Peking, China announced that the yuan, the digital currency, that might be connected to the Diem network, and the Diem network is the successor of Facebook's Libra. And so, in other words, on the surface, we have all these little frictions between the US and China. But on the other hand, in the background, and no media outlet reports about this. Yes, they talk about Facebook, Diem and Libra and the yuan, but hardly anybody will ever tell you that there are talks. And I'm not saying it will be like this. This is a thought. It's still in the making.
Well,
And but it shows that in the background, probably things are not as they appear.
No, it's all about position. They
Mhm.
all agree directionally on where they want to go on the agenda. It's just about who has more power and who's ultimately going to control everything after they get to the next step. So China has been made it very, very clear that they want to replace the US with their own currency for the world monetary system. And then they just haven't been all that upfront as to how they want to do it. And everybody's thinking it's the old system. Well, no, you don't replace something with an old system, you replace it with the new system. You know, I was traveling in Russia before I retired and on business, and I was reading, and this was say 2014 or 2015, and they were predicting that the US currency would be replaced by 2017 to another currency. So they've been working on it for a while. They just can't quite get it done as fast as they want to get it done. But they're always working in that direction. So when that's being printed in the Russian newspapers under Putin, you know, they've got information as to why they're saying that, and in terms of things happening in the background. And the pushback is always stronger than what they anticipate. So the best way to make it easier, once you've got the technology that's I think is working out its bugs, but as it's moving into place, the best way to eliminate the US dollar when you're ready to go is because the US becomes bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
So now when you look at how they're doing that, is this whole thing in terms of how they want to do the global reset is by having governments indebt themselves so far as one of the pillars that they have to set up a new system. And what they do when they do that is they're going to, one of the pillars is how they're going to pay for this debt that there's no other way of paying for, is that they're going to confiscate all property. Nobody can own property anymore. And pretty much all of the visible wealth. The truly rich won't have their money taken for. But if let's say you're Bill Gates, his money's visible. That will be taken. But he will be awarded in the new economy loans or money to become even wealthier, right? As part of his reward. So look for the global reset to do a lot of that work, mainly through debt, but they've got 7 points, and it's environmental sustainability. So look for more of that, because as the green movement gets even more radical and greenhouse gases and blah, 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 you know, we're going to be destroyed from the face of the earth, you know, the echoes of the false prophets and that are coming. And understand that the people who created modern science through the Royal Society, the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons, they called themselves the last of the sorcerers and the first of the scientists. That's because their knowledge of cult, and they created the sciences. And that sorcery that's in the King James Version Bible goes back to 3 different words of the same format: pharmakia, pharmakus, and pharmakos, which is sorceries that Babylon is going to deceive the whole world with. And pharmacy is the root word for everything pharmaceutical, including vaccines, and that is a charm and a spell in the polytheist understanding as well. Anyways, so that, but they want fairer economies. So they want socialism through all their imposed equity, which means they can do it any way they want, call it fair. So
because it has worked so great.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's worked so great. They want technology all for the good of their cause. They want to, reskill workers for the future work. That sounds like massive layoffs and repositioning into slavery to do the work to keep the wealthy. They want the whole feudal system put back in place. They want to have better businesses. In other words, they all want left-wing oligopolies working for their cause, which they're really, doing well. They want fair access to all. and that's the end of meritocracy. So fair access to all isn't raising the standards, it's lowering everything down where everybody, is just all that one sort of class. And they want to go beyond geopolitics. And that's the end of borders. It's the end of the way we know it, and it's the introduction of world government. And what they want to do in terms of taking all of your money is to pay for it is they want to get rid of the complete middle class so that they only have that feudal system back in place. And that's going to be the key, and they own all of the land. So look for the global reset that they keep talking about. And another thing to look for in their words that they're saying is that never miss the opportunity that comes up from a catastrophe.
Yeah.
It's always right. So because they're causing the catastrophes, and just as they're going to cause global economic disaster through debt, it's all planned, it's all contrived, and they're working diabolically towards that. They're frustrated that they can't do it at the pace that they want. And they won't be able to. They'll be able to push slowly in that direction until things happen very quickly and until the restrainer is removed. But the restrainer doesn't stop the empires and the world government from coming. It just slows it down and pushes against it and makes it more difficult to bring about Antichrist. The restrainer is designed to prevent Antichrist from coming to power. So the restrainer, if it's the Holy Spirit, as some people think, which is why the Holy Spirit in Mark and Luke is depicted as still being here to help those who are testifying in the name of Jesus to talk and not worry about the words that you're going to say, is still there. And or if it's Michael doesn't stand up to fight against Satan until the midpoint of the last 7 years. So he isn't pulled back. He's the one who fights against the beast empires in Daniel. So he's not stopping them from coming to power. He's stopping them from permitting Antichrist to come to power.
Mm. Yeah, I found this interesting here about China and Facebook. You have China and a US corporation.
And Google working together.
Yeah. And that, of course, will, at the same time, Europe will be flooded again with migrants. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that means that, Europe has probably to follow that US-China model. Yes. Because there will not be a lot that they can put against it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, and again, we're just starting to see some of the visibility of the power structures coming into place. So pharmaceutical companies are going to be a big part of that.
Yeah. And
they're yet to make the wealth that they're going to need to do what they want to do, which is why they need vaccines.
Mm. So now, if all of this has to happen before the Antichrist can really emerge, what exactly is his role? What has he to accomplish?
What will be his accomplishments, or what's he trying to do?
Because let's say one world religion, one world government, one world currency, everything is in place.
Yep.
So what's his job?
His job is to convince people to swear loyalty to them.
Okay.
And in return for what we're going to give you, you need to fight for your freedom. Just as the fallen angels, for their freedom against the oppressive God of the universe. Mm-hmm. And to convince people of that, not only will they have to have the ability to give them long life and access to all knowledge, which is the beast system will do that, but they are going to have to convince those people that they have the power to overthrow God, and that there's this vast alliance in the universe that is lined up to fight against them. And for us to have our seat at that galactic table, we're going to have to fight for our freedom. But to convince people of that, they have to get our technology in place so that you have weapons that we can't imagine today that will be deployed, that there is DNA manipulation and technology available at that level to create some of these types of war creatures that we see in Revelation 9 and Joel 1 and 2. We're still getting to that point. Now, they may be getting closer all the time and we just haven't seen it, but they need to be able to make this case that we are strong enough to overthrow the God of the Bible. Because when you get into the midpoint and people are going to take this oath of allegiance consummated by the mark, at this point in time, you have the war in heaven. And there's this war going on. And in Daniel 8, Antichrist was going to try and raise his throne to heaven, just as Satan tried to do. And they're going to throw down some of the starry host and trample on them. Mm-hmm. So that's a war. That's in heaven that's happening. That's different than the earthly war. And that people are going to see this war play out, and that Antichrist is still going to be standing and ruling, because Armageddon doesn't come until the end of the last 7 years. And that's 3.5 years after the war in heaven.
Mm-hmm. So if media, politicians, everybody calls him Messiah, will people not assume that he has been sent by God? Because to me, that would be the logic conclusion, that many people will think that. But how does he make the turn that now he has to inform his followers that he is fighting against the God?
Well, I think they've been setting the table for that. I think that what they're doing is they're lowering that expectation that you're fighting gods, that these are just advanced beings. I think that's part of the alien deception that's coming along. And it's kind of like Star Wars, where you have, the evil lords against the rebellions. And of course, the people asked to take the mark are going to be the rebellion ones, right? They're good guys, which is that polytheist religion. And that this battle that is going to take place is against a phony Messiah and an evil God. So they've already classified in polytheism that God is the evil God of the Bible. He caused the flood because he's anti-human. He caused people to be enslaved in matter, and he doesn't give you any knowledge, and on and on and on. And the whole conquest of the promised land was another example of, this evil God's evilness, and that he is no stronger or powerful, and they're equal, just as polytheism believes that Satan is the equal of God, that there are two angels, and they're in this perpetual battle, and you have to fight for your freedom. And they will be de-deifying Jesus because it doesn't fit, right? So they have to de-deify Jesus, and they're going to come out with evidence to saying that Jesus was, it'll be false evidence, but there'll be old evidence that Jesus didn't die on the cross, and that he never claimed himself to be God. Only Paul did. So they got to discredit Paul, and he's going to be the evil heretic, as it's talked about in the apocalyptic writings out of the Essenes.
I don't see him as God either. If anything, he is God's son.
Yeah. Yes, but a lot of Christians think he's God, right?
Oh, okay.
Okay, but he's going to be de-deified from being the Word of God as well, and that he wouldn't have been resurrected. And he's also going to be shown to have married Mary Magdalene, just as the Gnostics believe, and that he's had a bloodline, and that, it was just this rogue set of literalists that deified Jesus to become the Son of God, and he was just a prophet, an incarnated prophet. So he would have had the help of an angel, just as Vishnu incarnated into Buddha, and just as Antichrist will have an incarnation that will also do that. But he's not what Christians have made him out to be, or what Paul made him out to be. And so they're going to prove to people, even though it'll be false, but they'll have evidence that Jesus didn't die on the cross. And as Paul said, which again goes back to that, this is where they break the back of Christians, and Paul said, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, wasn't resurrected, this is the single doctrine Christianity's faith hangs on. So if that's a lie, Christianity is a lie. And they're going to turn that against Christian and show them Christianity, and they're going to show and deceive people that Jesus isn't the Christ, and that there is one yet to come, which is going to be the Messiah, the Antichrist.
Oh my goodness.
So we'll need to see more of that. So things are still sort of coming together. They've prepared the world well through the knowledge cult of the sciences, where if you look at the 7 sacred sciences, how they were created, this is what they're doing in science and education today. It was created to, first of all, honor the pantheon of their gods. So everything they do is designed to honor them. And they do that all throughout science. The second thing was to not give God credit for anything, which that's what science does. It takes God right out of the whole equation, and to degrade God, which is what the polytheist religions do and what science does. And the most important thing is to lead people away from God, which doctrines like evolution and all the attacks that they have on Christianity is designed to do, so that they can prepare people to say, well, we've been told this all along. That was just what Tolkien and Lewis talked about, is that eucatastrophe, that it's a fairy tale, and the eucatastrophe is just a sort of preconceived ending to give it a happy ending. And so Jesus didn't rise after being killed. He never was killed, and you need to be an adept to understand the scriptures. It needs to be understood in the interpretive level, and you need to be an adept to understand what's written in the Bible.
And Christians will buy that?
Many.
Okay.
Many will. Many will. Not all, because obviously there will be the tribulations against the Christians. And but what Jesus said is that all of this will deceive the elect if that were possible, and it happens. So we can't believe the church leaders, but there will be those who have prepared themselves not to be deceived, who won't be fooled, and those are the ones who will have to be persecuted.
Personally, and this, I'm just speculating here, but I would not be surprised if, in general, I'm not saying there will not be exceptions here and there, but in general, that the churches and the religions will support that entire agenda.
They will. They do not teach prehistory. They do not teach prophecy. So they are not preparing Christians. They are, for how to prepare for the end time, and to educate as many other people as they can and get the word out. They are preparing for Christians to be ready to be deceived. And a lot of the priests and ministers today, they don't believe in the resurrection. So you know how easily they'll be to convert, that it's an allegory, is what they say. And one of the allegories that they'll lean on, there'll be many, but this one's been out there for a long time, is that Jesus said that the only sign that he would give his generation as to who he was in ancient Judea in the time of the Romans was the sign of Jonah. And then they always come back and say, well, you don't believe somebody was swallowed by a fish for 3 days. That's just a fable. That's just an allegory to make a point. It's like a parable to make a point. And then they come back and say, well, if Jesus was saying his sign was a parable, an allegory, not literal, that he would be in the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish, then it's the meaning that we are now giving you that he was telling you. And that it's not the resurrection that's important. It's your evolving as a human being into godhood in the physical world, which they'll be promising.
My goodness, what confusing times we are heading into.
Yeah, and we see science merging with religion already, and the religions of the secret societies, and I'm sure I've talked about this in the past on some of the other shows. That's the Gnostic religion, which created theosophy, which was responsible for Ariosophy of Nazi Germany, which is also the founder of the New Age movement. So they created theosophy to be this worldwide movement that was designed to be what's going to happen in the end time, which was their thought. And this end time religion was going to merge with science and work in harmony with science. Just as they created the sciences and the teachings of the universities, it's going to be this House of Solomon that Francis Bacon had described in the New Atlantis, where you have this end time religion that works in perfect harmony with science. It doesn't work in perfect harmony with Christianity or monotheistic Judaism, but it works in perfect harmony with the knowledge cult of polytheism.
Bacon, the one who was most likely Shakespeare?
Likely was Shakespeare. He's just, there's a lot to that. I've got a couple articles on the King James Version Bible, Bacon and Shakespeare, if people want to get a hold of me on that. But what's interesting is that Bacon had created 2 societies, writing societies, to create a new language that he had imagined would be the new universal language for the then envisioned empire of England that was going to rise. And he was very powerful in both the Elizabethan, Elizabeth I dynasty, and then the Stuart dynasty, and very influential as the last editor to the King James Version Bible. So he's creating this language that the KJV Bible is written in. Those 2 societies' names were Knights of the Helmet, which has its own interesting sort of connotation. So the important one is the Spear Shaker Society, which Shakespeare is thought to have taken his name from, and who was Francis Bacon, who wrote under that name. And that goes back to Apollo and I'm trying to think of her name, that was his consort, Athena, who held a spear and shook it, and was a patron of the sciences and religions. So there's a lot to it. That's just one piece.
Well, I just remembered when you talked about Adolf Hitler, of course he was not the Antichrist, that's a given, but he was a character like that. And so we know that the colors of Atlantis, that was black, white, and red. So, and the Nazis had exactly that in their flag. And I'm sometimes wondering if, because not everybody who was in the Nazi party, that was a minuscule, minority that were really well read in occult things. And but some of them were really into the dark occult. And I wonder sometimes if they picked the colors because they believe that they are reincarnated Atlantean warlords or whatever.
Oh, sure they did.
Mm.
They believed in the Aryans, that they, adopted, their Volkish and Grail ideology onto theosophy. And they're created in part and funded in part by a lot of societies. One would be the Thule Society. Thule was a civilization like Atlantis, so either a different culture's version of Atlantis or part of the Atlantean Empire, but certainly Atlantean in its sort of understanding, and that they were ruled over by giants, and that they were descended from Thule or Atlantis, and that they were recreating that new Atlantis in sort of their own image, I guess would be a way to do it. And they thought if they could backwards engineer the DNA, they could recreate the giants of old. And they didn't have the technology yet to do that, but they did try to create the new man, which is the new Nephilim concept, right? That through eugenics and things like that, that they were going to create the new man. So they very, very much believed that the Aryans were from Atlantis. And the Thule Society, I think, is just that sort of allegory or vernacular North Germanic or Swedish sort of understanding of who Atlantis was, or a recollection of Atlantis as being the same place.
The entire agenda has been a long time in the making.
It has, and I think you could look at what happened with the rise of National Socialism is what is happening now. Only it's socialism on a global scale, which is why they got to discredit anything that's national based. So if you're a patriot, now you're a National Socialist, right? They label you as a Nazi, and that.
And the funny thing is that they always say extreme right-wingers. How can anything with socialism, how is that right-wing?
It's not, and it shows you the brainwashing that has gone on to make people believe that, right? The only thing they are right of would be the anarchists or the communists, but they are still, and this is the system that they want to recreate, is National Socialism on a global scale, which means all the oligopolies will work in partnership with the government for government policy, right? And there'll only be the bloodlines who can control the corporations. And World War II, or the National Socialism rise to power, and what they did is a terrific analogy on a smaller scale as to what the end time is going to be all about. I mean, you have a Messiah type of figure with the Fuhrer, and it's very much a Messianic term in Volkisch ideology. And you have the Reichschurch being created for the new religion that's going to replace all the other religions. And it goes back to polytheism and to Atlantis. So expect Atlantean connections and that new Atlantis we talked about for the world government. He wants to create a 1,000-year reign, just as Antichrist will, and just as Jesus is promising. They receive knowledge that is inexplicably and unexplained, that took a bankrupt nation to be able to develop the technology, to develop the most advanced tanks ever seen before, that are still the basis for what tanks with Panzer and Tiger tanks are today. That's still the base for how they build tanks today. That they created these jet engines, that they created rocket engines, that they created all of this technology and advances that meshed perfectly together, like the Blitzkrieg strategy that came out of nowhere. And there's no reason except for how that comes about, except for what they said. And they said they received that knowledge and that ramp up from their spiritual masters, the Great White Brotherhood, their celestial masters, whatever you want to call them, demons, angels, fallen angels. aliens, they receive
Yeah.
that knowledge to ramp them up. And that's
Maria
very similar
Orsic.
to what we're seeing now again.
Maria Orsic was one of was a medium that worked with them, and she had a group of women, and they had extremely long hair down to the ankles, and they always said that that way they can better connect to spirit beings.
Yeah.
And she channeled a lot of things, and yeah, and then later on somebody said that one of her last personal messages was allegedly was that we are all leaving here, we will no longer be here on this earth. So
Yeah, hard to know what that means, where they went.
yeah, she
Yeah.
was I don't know what it was,
Yeah.
and if
Yeah.
it was to the moon or whatever,
Yeah.
but that is something like that
Right.
was
Yeah.
what she was talking about.
So anyways, I think, and complete with a, a genocide called Holocaust in this case, but, expand it on a larger scale to genocide that will include Jewish people in the end time, as well with many, many peoples. So I think it's a good, if you want to have sort of that analogy of what to expect, look at that. Not with the wars that Antichrist necessarily brings at the beginning, although wars will bring him to power, but trying to set up that world government in a national socialism model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh boy. Oh boy. Yeah, Gary. That was really a great talk. I thank you so much. Is there anything that you would like to add that I have not asked, or something where you feel it's important that you leave this message?
Well, I think, I talked about a lot about that, we need to look for this universal religion and understand who and what it's going to be. So we know it's going to be a city, and it's between Revelation 14, 17, and 18. I think it says Babylon is a city 9 times. It's a city that's going to be destroyed. So we should be looking for that city, and that the religion that is described in it has a lot of additional information to the meaning. So I think it's going to be that mystery religion. It's going to be that ancient Enochian mysticism, as I like to call it, that crossed the flood, that restarted at Babel with an Antichrist and archetype type figure. And so, the word great is the great, great whore, or the great Babylon, as it's used, is the Greek word megas. And that means in the external form as being of size and of age. So of great, old, and very, very, very large, and also of rank and authority, and great as in with superior beings. So it should have sort of all of that. And Hur is connected to a lot of words, but that is understood as a prostitute and idolatry. And sort of the chief seat of idolatry was in Rome at that time. And the woman, as it's described, is part of that duality of the religion as a daughter of Babylon, but also with the male and the female goddess that is equal or even more powerful than the male god. And Babylon derives from the Hebrew word Babel, and it was the capital of Chaldea, but it was also where this religion restarted after the flood. And harlot works in connection with the Hur, as she's also called, which is the Greek word porn, P-O-R-N-E, which again goes to that sort of all of that imagery. And if you were a Hur or a prostitute in the allegory that's described in the Old Testament, that means you were marrying another god or taking another god as a partner. So it was used in the context of Israel worshiping in polytheism. And she is the mother of harlots. And that's literally mother, as in the Magna Mater, the great mother, right? Which is a significant term in Gnosticism and polytheisms. And you know, the word abominations that is used in context with her, with a cup of abomination, literally means idolatry. So worshiping idols and polytheist gods. So we know it's going to be polytheism. And mystery, great mystery religion, you know, that's mysterion is the Greek word for that, means hidden things, secrets, knowledge, and initiates and degrees of knowledge. So it's a knowledge cult. So we know it's a polytheist mystery religion. And she's the one who sits on many people. So we know it's a universal religion, and she rides the seven empires. Just as she was part of that organizational structure for all of the seven beast empires. And where people kind of get confused, where it says 7 hills and 7 kings. It doesn't say or, it's both. So the allegory in there is that she sits on 7 hills or 7 mountains, not Vatican Hill, because that's outside the original 7 cities of Rome. But that doesn't mean the Vatican's not going to be a part, because the Sibylline mysteries were located at, I'm trying to remember the name of the hill, starts with P, but anyways, Vatican Hill is the branch hill and branch temple of where the Sibylline prophecies were. And so I think there's going to be a connection that the Vatican is going to be part of that. And we know that the 7 hills were the most famous 7 hills, or 7 mountains at the time of John writing it, and that Babylon was an allegory, as you take Babylon back to Greek in the New Testament, an allegory for Rome. And so you got all these things that are pointing at it for Rome, but it's also the 7 are the 7 kings. So it's separate, and that's not an either or. The 7 kings are the 7 kings or Antichrist type figures of those beast empires. So it's both, and people should not get that confused. And she rides that beast with those 7 heads of 7 kings. She's been part of that organizational structure after the flood since Babel, and was part of that organizational structure before the flood with the Nephilim kings.
And now it comes to an end. Don't you think? Ultimately, it's just the timetable, how fast. But I think we're in the fig tree generation, and I think we're in the birth pangs. So now it's a matter of how fast and how it plays out, and that we need to be prepared for this continual march towards global occupation. Yeah. So I thank you very much for coming, Gary. And yeah, that was it. Night flight for today. We see you all next time. Stay safe and sound out there. Bye-bye.